I refused to help my neighbor, then heard screaming, "Next do." The air in my small suburban house always felt a little too still, a little too quiet. I liked it that way. My life was meticulously ordered, a carefully constructed fortress against the messy unpredictability of others. I worked from home, my days a predictable rhythm of client calls, spreadsheets, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Neighbors were a necessary evil, a blurry presence on the periphery of my carefully curated existence. I paid my dues, kept my lawn neat, and offered a curt nod if I happened to cross paths. Beyond that, I kept them at arm's length. It wasn't that I disliked them, not really. It was just easier, less complicated. My focus was on my own goals, my own peace. Empathy felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, a drain on my limited emotional resources. I prided myself on my self-sufficiency, my ability to navigate life's challenges alone. This self-reliance, I now understand, was a gilded cage, built from a deep-seated fear of vulnerability, and a quiet arrogance that whispered I was better off without the complications of genuine connection. My neighbor, a woman named Eleanor, was the epitome of that complication. She was a widow, her house a stark contrast to mine, a riot of overgrown roses and wind chimes that tinkled incessantly. I'd seen her struggle, her small frame bent under the weight of groceries, her car sputtering at the end of her driveway. Each time, a tiny voice in my head would whisper a suggestion of help, a fleeting impulse to offer a hand. But then another, louder voice would interject, a familiar refrain of self-preservation. "It's not your problem. You have your own things to deal with. She'll manage." And so, I'd retreat back into my sanctuary, the faint guilt a dull throb I'd learned to ignore. I'd convince myself that my detachment was a form of strength, a necessary boundary. I was too busy, too focused on my own ambitions to get entangled in the everyday dramas of others. One sweltering Tuesday afternoon, the sun beat down relentlessly, baking the asphalt and making the air thick and heavy. I was deep in a crucial project, the kind that demanded absolute concentration, the kind that paid handsomely for meticulous attention. My phone buzzed, a notification from my home security system. A brief alert. Motion detected at Eleanor's front door. I glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance. Probably a delivery person, I thought, or one of her relatives. I dismissed it, my mind already back on the intricate details of the report I was compiling. The world outside my walls felt distant, irrelevant. My carefully constructed peace was paramount. I was on the cusp of a breakthrough, a moment of professional triumph. The outside world, with its demands and its people, could wait. It always could. I remember the drone of the cicadas, a relentless, high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of my house. I was hunched over my laptop, the blue light casting a sterile glow on my face. The clock on my screen ticked past 4 p.m., then 4:30. The silence of my house was a familiar comfort, a testament to my ordered life. Suddenly a different sound sliced through the afternoon haze, a guttural, desperate scream. It was raw, primal, and it jolted me out of my focused stupor. It wasn't a scream of anger or frustration, but of pure, unadulterated terror. It ripped through the quiet, shattering the illusion of my isolated peace. It was coming from next door, from Eleanor's house. A cold dread, unfamiliar and sharp, began to coil in my stomach. My carefully constructed walls suddenly felt very thin. The motion detector alert, dismissed moments before, now echoed in my mind with a chilling premonition. I had ignored the first sign, the subtle tremor before the earthquake. Now, the earth was shaking. The scream, a single piercing shriek, was followed by a sickening thud. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of alarm. I stood frozen, my mind racing, a chaotic jumble of fear and disbelief. This wasn't a neighborly dispute or a minor inconvenience. This was something else entirely. My carefully maintained detachment crumbled, replaced by a visceral terror that clawed at my throat. I hadn't answered Eleanor's silent pleas for help, her visible struggles. Now, a far more urgent plea was echoing through the thick, humid air, a plea I could no longer ignore. The stillness I so cherished was gone, replaced by the chilling echo of that scream. I stumbled towards the front door, my hands shaking as I reached for the lock. The meticulously ordered world I had built was about to be irrevocably shattered. I threw open my front door, the hinges groaning in protest. The afternoon sun, moments before a symbol of oppressive heat, now seemed blindingly harsh, exposing the raw reality of the situation. The screaming had stopped, but a new sound had taken its place. A frantic, desperate banging from Eleanor's side door, accompanied by the frantic, muffled cries of a child. My breath hitched. Child? The image of Eleanor, frail and alone, flashed in my mind, but now it was overlaid with the terrifying realization that there was a child involved. My indifference, my carefully cultivated detachment, felt like a lead weight in my chest, crushing me. I had refused to help an elderly woman, a decision made in the name of my own convenience. Now, a child's life was in peril, and my inaction felt like a betrayal of the most fundamental human instinct. My feet moved before my mind could fully process the implications. I sprinted across the patch of sun-scorched lawn that separated our houses, the manicured perfection of my own yard, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding next door. The banging grew louder, more desperate. I reached Eleanor's side door, a weathered wooden barrier that suddenly seemed impossibly fragile. I could hear Eleanor's voice now, strained and panicked, trying to soothe a terrified child. "It's okay, sweetie, just hold on. Help is coming." Her words, laced with a fear I'd never heard before, echoed the terror I felt churning within me. I raised my hand, my knuckles rapping against the wood, a hesitant, almost apologetic sound. The door burst open, revealing Eleanor, her face a mask of terror and exhaustion. Her eyes, usually a gentle blue, were wide with panic, darting between me and the scene behind her. She was holding a small girl, no older than 5, her face buried in Eleanor's shoulder, her tiny body trembling uncontrollably. The girl's sobs were a raw, heart-wrenching sound. Eleanor's gaze met mine, and in that instant, I saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else, a desperate plea for help, a silent acknowledgement of my earlier refusal, and perhaps a nascent flicker of forgiveness. He broke in, Eleanor stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with unspeakable horror. He's still in the house. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My carefully constructed world of quiet solitude had just collided with a brutal reality I had always managed to avoid. My first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to retreat back into the safety of my own home. The primal fear of danger, of the unknown, was a powerful siren song. But then I saw the little girl's face, peeking out from Eleanor's shoulder. Her eyes, wide and dark, held a raw terror that mirrored the scream I had heard. Her small hand, clutching Eleanor's floral dress, was clenched into a tiny white-knuckled fist. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of my indifference didn't just crack. They imploded. The arrogance that had told me I was better off alone, that empathy was a weakness, felt like a bitter, poisonous lie. I saw not a stranger in need, but a child, pure and vulnerable, caught in a nightmare. The abstract concept of neighbor dissolved, replaced by the undeniable, gut-wrenching reality of a shared humanity. Eleanor, still trembling, clutched the little girl tighter. He came through the back window," she choked out, her voice ragged. "I heard the glass break. I grabbed Lily and ran to the front, but he was already inside. I managed to lock the side door, but..." Her voice trailed off, her eyes wide with unshed tears. The little girl, Lily, let out a soft whimper, her small body shaking against Eleanor's chest. The air was thick with the smell of dust and fear. I could hear the faint creak of floorboards from inside Eleanor's house, a chilling reminder of the unseen threat. My mind, usually so quick to analyze and strategize, was a blank canvas of primal fear and a burgeoning, agonizing sense of responsibility. My carefully constructed life, a monument to order and self-interest, felt laughably fragile in the face of this raw, unfolding horror. I had always believed that strength lay in solitude, in the absence of entanglement. Now, standing on Eleanor's porch, the terrified sobs of a child in my ears, I understood the profound, dangerous fallacy of that belief. My strength had been a hollow shell, my independence a carefully crafted illusion. True strength, I was beginning to grasp, lay not in isolation, but in connection, in the willingness to step outside one's own carefully guarded world, even when fear screamed at you to stay put. I took a deep, shaky breath, the humid air doing little to calm the frantic beating of my heart. My gaze fell on a sturdy, decorative iron poker resting by Eleanor's fireplace, visible through the open doorway. It was heavy, solid, a stark contrast to the flimsy excuses I'd made for my inaction. Without a word, I stepped past Eleanor, my eyes fixed on the shadowed interior of her home. The little girl, Lily, let out a small cry, her grip tightening on Eleanor's dress. Eleanor's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and a desperate, unspoken hope. I didn't look back. The decision once made felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. The fortress of my own making had been breached, not by an external force, but by the undeniable call of a shared vulnerability. Moving through Eleanor's house was like stepping into a nightmare. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the drawn curtains, illuminating a scene of quiet domesticity brutally interrupted. The air was heavy with the scent of stale potpourri and a metallic tang that spoke of something far more sinister. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of displaced fabric, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I moved with a stealth I didn't know I possessed, my senses heightened, the world reduced to a series of sharp, urgent stimuli. My own self-interest, my carefully guarded peace, had evaporated, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct I hadn't known I was capable of. I found him in the living room, hunched over a small antique jewelry box, his back to the window. He was a shadow, a hulking silhouette against the muted light. He didn't hear me approach, lost in his act of violation. The iron poker felt heavy in my hand, a crude but effective weapon. My heart pounded, not with the fear of my own safety, but with a desperate urgency to end this, to protect the innocent. This wasn't about bravery, it was about necessity, about the primal urge to shield the vulnerable from harm. The arrogance that had kept me isolated had been replaced by a profound, humbling understanding of our interconnectedness, a realization that the pain of one is, in some way, the pain of all. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged. The poker connected with a sickening thud, and the intruder cried out, stumbling forward. He turned, his eyes wide with surprise and fury, revealing a face etched with desperation. He was gaunt, his clothes threadbare, a man clearly at the end of his rope. Yet the desperation in his eyes did not diminish the terror he had inflicted. He lunged at me, but the element of surprise was gone. We grappled, a clumsy, desperate dance amidst overturned furniture and scattered photographs, the remnants of a life I had so carelessly ignored. The struggle was brief, brutal, and utterly disorienting. I wasn't fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Eleanor, for Lily, for the fragile sanctity of a home. I saw a flash of fear in his eyes, not of me, but of the consequences, of the path that had led him here. It was a fleeting glimpse into a despair I had never known, a despair that had driven him to this desperate act, but it did not excuse it. It did not erase the terror he had inflicted. With a final desperate shove, I sent him sprawling towards the shattered remains of the back window. He scrambled to his feet, his gaze flicking between me and the open escape route. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then vanished into the dense, humid air, leaving behind only the lingering scent of fear and desperation. I stood there, chest heaving, the iron poker still clutched in my trembling hand. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. I looked around the ransacked room, the overturned lamps, the scattered contents of the jewelry box, the shattered glass glinting like malevolent diamonds. This was the consequence of my indifference, the brutal manifestation of a problem I had chosen to ignore. My carefully constructed peace had been shattered, not by the intruder, but by my own inaction. Eleanor emerged from the hallway, Lily still clinging to her small face now streaked with tears, but her eyes no longer filled with pure terror. They held a quiet gratitude, a profound understanding that transcended words. She looked at me, her gaze steady, and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of thanks for my physical intervention, but for my presence, for finally stepping out of my self-imposed isolation and acknowledging her humanity, her vulnerability. The iron poker, once a symbol of my potential for violence, now felt like a weight of responsibility, a stark reminder of the moment my carefully constructed world had irrevocably fractured. As the police arrived and the necessary procedures unfolded, I found myself drawn back to Eleanor's side. The little girl, Lily, had finally stopped crying and was now watching me with a quiet curiosity. Eleanor, her voice still a little shaky, began to tell me about her son, who had been struggling with addiction, about the mounting bills, about the constant fear that had been her companion since her husband passed. She spoke not of blame, but of exhaustion, of a loneliness that had gnawed at her for years. I listened, truly listened for the first time. The arrogance that had once defined me seemed to shrink with each word she spoke, replaced by a growing sense of shame and a dawning awareness of the immense suffering I had chosen to overlook. Later, after the police had left and the house was quiet again, Eleanor offered me a cup of tea. We sat in her slightly disheveled living room, the remnants of the night's terror still palpable, but a fragile peace beginning to settle. Lily, no longer clinging to Eleanor, sat on the floor, drawing with a set of crayons Eleanor had found. She looked up at me, her small hand holding a bright red crayon, and offered a shy, tentative smile. In that simple gesture, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience, of a connection forged in crisis, I felt a profound shift within me. I had refused to help my neighbor, blinded by my own self-importance, and then heard screaming next door, a sound that had ripped through my carefully constructed isolation. The experience had been terrifying, humbling, and ultimately redemptive. I learned that day that the walls we build to protect ourselves are often the very things that imprison them. True strength isn't found in isolation, but in the courage to connect, to extend a hand even when fear whispers otherwise. Empathy isn't a weakness to be shed, but a fundamental pillar of our humanity, a bridge that connects us to the suffering and joy of others. My self-reliance had been a form of pride, a shield against the messy, beautiful, and often painful reality of shared existence. The screams I heard were not just a call for help, but a call to my own buried humanity. The little girl's red crayon drawing, a vibrant, chaotic swirl of colors, lay on the floor between us. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a splash of hope in the aftermath of darkness. I realized then that sometimes the people we dismiss, the lives we deem too complicated or too different, are the very ones who hold the keys to our own awakening. They are the unexpected encounters that crack open our carefully constructed worlds, revealing the truth that we are all, in our own ways, neighbors in this fragile, interconnected existence. The hours that followed the intruder's departure were a strange blend of official procedure and quiet, shared vulnerability. The police, efficient and thorough, documented the scene, their presence a stark reminder of the violation that had occurred. I observed them, their practiced movements a stark contrast to the raw, exposed emotion that still hung heavy in Eleanor's living room. My own internal landscape had shifted dramatically. The self-imposed walls that had defined my existence for so long had not just crumbled. They had been obliterated by the sheer force of shared human experience. My prior focus on meticulous order and personal achievement now seemed woefully inadequate, a hollow pursuit divorced from genuine connection. As the officers meticulously catalogued evidence, the splintered glass, the overturned furniture, the scattered photographs that offered glimpses into a life I had so easily overlooked, I found myself drawn to the small, almost imperceptible gestures between Eleanor and Lily. Eleanor, her voice regaining a semblance of its usual warmth, would gently stroke Lily's hair, her touch a silent balm to the child's lingering fear. Lily, in turn, would lean into her grandmother's embrace, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch Eleanor's cheek, a gesture of reassurance that spoke volumes. These quiet exchanges, seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of the evening's events, were profound revelations to me. They illustrated a depth of reciprocal care, a silent language of comfort and trust that had been absent from my own life for so long. The understanding began to dawn on me that my previous perception of help had been transactional, a cold calculation of effort versus reward. I had viewed it as an imposition, a drain on my resources. Now, witnessing Eleanor's quiet strength, her unwavering devotion to Lily, I saw help not as an obligation but as an inherent part of the human fabric. It was a flowing river, not a stagnant pool. It was about offering presence, not just solutions, about sharing the burden, not just alleviating it. This realization was not an intellectual exercise. It was a visceral, emotional recalibration. I felt a profound ache, a longing for that kind of deep, unspoken connection. A connection I had actively, albeit unknowingly, pushed away for years. My own internal narrative had always been one of self-sufficiency, a carefully constructed story of competence and independence. This narrative, I now understood, had served as a powerful defense mechanism, a way to avoid the perceived risks of vulnerability and emotional entanglement. Yet, standing in Eleanor's slightly disheveled living room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of a life lived in community, I saw the profound limitations of that story. It had kept me safe, perhaps, but it had also kept me isolated, profoundly alone in my carefully curated world. The intruder, in his desperation, had inadvertently become a catalyst, forcing me to confront the hollowness of my own carefully constructed existence. The quiet moments after the police departed were more potent than any dramatic confrontation. Eleanor, her initial shock giving way to a weary resilience, began to pick up the scattered photographs from the floor. She would pause, a faint smile touching her lips as she looked at a faded image, then continue her task with a quiet determination. I found myself instinctively kneeling beside her, my hands reaching for a cluster of photos that had fallen near the shattered window. We worked in companionable silence, our hands brushing occasionally as we gathered the remnants of her life. There was no grand pronouncement, no dramatic apology on my part. It was a simple, shared act of restoration, a silent acknowledgement of our shared humanity in the face of adversity. This shared task, this quiet act of mending what had been broken, felt more significant than any grand gesture I could have conceived. It was a tangible demonstration of a new understanding, a nascent empathy taking root. The subtle shift in my internal landscape was undeniable. The arrogance that had once dictated my interactions had begun to recede, replaced by a burgeoning sense of humility and a profound appreciation for the simple yet powerful act of being present for another. The fear of vulnerability, though still a shadow, was no longer an insurmountable barrier. It was being slowly, steadily, eroded by the quiet strength of shared experience. The quiet shared task of gathering the scattered photographs evolved into something more profound than mere tidying. As Eleanor and I sifted through the images, a narrative began to emerge, one that painted a picture far richer and more complex than my initial assumptions had allowed. I saw her not just as an elderly widow struggling with her roses, but as a woman who had navigated decades of life, marked by both profound joy and deep sorrow. There were pictures of her wedding day, her hand clasped tightly in her husband's, their faces alight with a youthful optimism that felt achingly familiar. Then came images of children, their small hands reaching out, their laughter almost palpable even in the still frames. And later, images of grandchildren, their bright eyes mirroring Eleanor's own, a testament to a lineage of love and connection. Building on this revelation, I began to see my own life, with its carefully curated solitude, as a deliberate rejection of this very richness. My focus on self-preservation had inadvertently stripped away the potential for these deeply interwoven narratives. I had prioritized an unblemished exterior, a facade of control, over the messy, unpredictable, yet ultimately deeply rewarding tapestry of human connection. Eleanor's home, despite its current disarray, was steeped in this history, a living testament to a life fully, if imperfectly, lived. The wind chimes, which I had once perceived as a mere annoyance, now seemed like gentle murmurs of memory, each tinkle a soft echo of shared moments. Furthermore, the intruder's presence, while terrifying, had inadvertently served as a stark catalyst, forcing me to confront the limitations of my own perspective. His desperation, born of circumstances I could only begin to imagine, highlighted the interconnectedness of our lives in ways I had never considered. It wasn't simply about offering aid, it was about recognizing the shared vulnerability that binds us all. My earlier refusal to help Eleanor, rooted in a misguided sense of self-protection, now felt like a profound failure of imagination, a refusal to see beyond my own immediate concerns. The sheer fragility of Eleanor's situation, coupled with the violent intrusion, underscored the precariousness of peace and the vital importance of community in weathering life's storms. The quiet act of sorting photographs also revealed a different facet of Eleanor's character, her remarkable resilience. Amidst images of happy gatherings, there were also subtle hints of hardship. A photograph of a younger Eleanor standing stoically beside a barren field, another of her hand resting on a hospital bed. These were not framed as tragedies, but as moments endured, overcome. This quiet strength, this ability to face adversity without succumbing to bitterness, was a lesson in itself. It spoke of an inner fortitude that transcended the outward circumstances, a deep well of courage that had sustained her through the years. It was a stark contrast to my own carefully constructed defenses, which felt brittle and easily shattered in comparison. Consequently, my understanding of neighbor expanded exponentially. It ceased to be a geographical designation and transformed into a profound ethical commitment. It was about acknowledging the shared space, not just physically, but emotionally and morally. It was about recognizing that the well-being of those around us is intrinsically linked to our own. My earlier indifference had been a form of self-imposed blindness, a deliberate ignorance of the intricate web of relationships that forms the foundation of a truly thriving community. The simple act of picking up fallen photographs became a profound metaphor for the larger task of rebuilding connections, of acknowledging the shared history and the interwoven destinies that bind us. Another crucial layer is the recognition of my own role in perpetuating a cycle of isolation. By consistently choosing detachment, I had not only deprived myself of the richness of human connection, but had also potentially contributed to the very vulnerability that Eleanor faced. My consistent refusal to engage, my steadfast adherence to my own isolated world, might have inadvertently reinforced her sense of being alone, making her more susceptible to the very dangers that ultimately materialized. This unsettling thought added a new dimension of culpability to my burgeoning sense of remorse. The screaming next door was not just a sudden crisis, it was, in a way, a consequence of a slow, steady erosion of mutual support. The weight of the photographs in my hands shifted from mere paper and ink to tangible fragments of a shared human experience, a stark counterpoint to my previous isolation. It wasn't just about seeing Eleanor's life. It was about recognizing the inherent value in the very act of being seen. My consistent refusal to engage had, in essence, rendered her invisible in the periphery of my existence. I had treated her existence as a background element, easily ignored. Now, holding these captured moments, I understood that her life, like mine, was a complex narrative deserving of acknowledgement, a story that mattered. This realization wasn't about pity. It was about a fundamental shift in my perception of worth. Every individual, regardless of their outward circumstances or my personal convenience, possessed an intrinsic dignity that demanded recognition. This understanding extended beyond Eleanor to a broader application of ethical awareness. Consider how this applies when you encounter individuals whose lives appear outwardly unremarkable, or whose situations seem disconnected from your own immediate concerns. The temptation to maintain a detached perspective, to categorize them as peripheral, is strong. Yet the lesson learned here is that behind every seemingly ordinary facade lies a universe of experiences, of joys and sorrows, of quiet struggles and triumphs, much like the unfolding stories within those photographs. To dismiss or overlook these narratives is to diminish not only the individual, but also the richness of our own interconnected reality. It's a failure to acknowledge the multifaceted nature of humanity that surrounds us. Furthermore, the intruder's presence, however unwelcome, acted as a disruptive force that exposed the inherent fragility of my self-imposed order. My meticulously constructed fortress, designed to keep the unpredictable at bay, had proven to be a permeable barrier against genuine human need and desperation. It highlighted the fallacy of believing that isolation equates to security. True security, I now grasp, is not built on the absence of external threats but on the strength of communal bonds, on the interconnectedness that allows individuals to support one another through adversity. My previous focus on personal control had blinded me to the far more robust resilience found in mutual reliance and shared responsibility. The true practice, I've come to understand, begins not with grand gestures but with the quiet, consistent effort to remain open, to acknowledge the narratives unfolding around us, even when they don't directly intersect with our own. It's in the willingness to see the individual behind the circumstance, to recognize the shared vulnerability that binds us, regardless of the walls we build or the distances we maintain. My previous focus on self-sufficiency had been a profound misunderstanding of strength. It was a brittle facade that crumbled under the slightest pressure. True resilience, I now see, is woven from the threads of connection, from the shared burdens and the collective triumphs that define our existence. The echoes of that scream, once a sound of pure terror, now serve as a potent reminder that the most profound awakenings often come from the most unexpected, and sometimes the most painful, encounters. It's in those moments, when our carefully constructed peace is shattered, that we are truly given the opportunity to rebuild, not on the foundation of isolation, but on the bedrock of empathy and shared understanding. The practice is in the everyday, in the quiet moments of choosing connection over detachment, in the simple yet transformative act of seeing and being seen. The world, once a series of separate islands, now feels like a vast interconnected ocean, and I am finally learning to